Who was the biggest fantasy football winner of the 2024 NFL Draft? That and more this week on the couch. Jake Ciely. Jake, who do you think was the biggest winner as we watched everything go down in Detroit 2 weeks ago?
The funny thing is, I think a lot of people would give the winner to a player that actually had nothing to do with the draft in Zamir White. I think that's a very popular pick. And I don't fault anybody for that. I think there's a lot to be seen whether he can be the guy over the entire season. But I'm actually going to go for a draft pick here. And it's funny, a lot of people sat here and joked and said, well, we're destroying the wide receiver room for Justin Herbert, and they're going to run the ball with Greg Roman 87 times a game, and who's ever going to pass the ball, and I think it's going to happen. And maybe this is because I had a soft spot for him because he was one of my favorite wide receivers that wasn't the big quote unquote three.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually think Lad McConkey is the big winner of this draft. There's others. I'm not going to say he's the only one and definitively the best one. But in my opinion, he was my favorite winner just because of the landing situation. Like Justin Herbert, whether you're on the path of thinking he can end up being a top 5 quarterback or the excitement around him was a little bit too early in his career, that aside, McConkey with Herbert, he could step in as the one. If you're talking about somebody, people have drawn the Cooper Cup comparisons, and let's chill out
Mm-hmm.
with every wide receiver that's in this draft is going to be the best ever situation. I think he is somebody that steps in as the one in the fact that Quentin Johnston, I don't think, is dead. I know there's a lot of people that want to write him off there for 1 year, and we saw everything. As a quick aside, and sorry to do this real quick, but like I love how we go from a first
Yeah.
rounder and it's like, hey, we understand Quentin Johnston's raw. But like 1 year later, when we saw the rawness, we saw the struggles, we understand he's still a first rounder. Everybody's like, "Oh, that's it, he's done. There's no hope for him." And I understand it's a new coaching regime, and that
Yeah.
obviously leans up against him. But I do think that the skill set of McConkey, no matter the team, presents better to this NFL, to this team. Quentin Johnston, at this profile of what he is, I always thought was going to be a number 2 or 3 possibly anyway, because the NFL is different than what it was when
Mm-hmm.
Quentin Johnston 10, 15 years ago, much better situation. But McConkey, what he brings,
Right.
I mean, I think we're talking about potentially 130, 140 targets. And with his skill set and what he brings with Justin Herbert, I think is the big winner. I could see him being in the conversation for the number 2 best rookie wide receiver outside of Marvin Harrison.
Yeah, especially if we're just talking about this year. And absolutely, I had
Mm-hmm.
McConkey, if we're looking at movers, I had him ninth in the Bloom 100 before the draft and sixth after. Um, Xavier Worthy actually was a little bit bigger mover, also in this conversation, especially now with this Rashee
Mm-hmm.
Rice stuff continuing to uh, persist, his name in the news for the wrong reasons. But let's talking quickly about McConkey. One of the things, Jake, that I think is really instructive when we're looking at McConkey is pushing back against groupthink. And don't get me wrong. I mean, sometimes there's groupthink because, well, a lot of smart people look at a situation and say, well, this is what's going to happen. But I think the groupthink on Justin Herbert and the number of pass attempts for the Chargers has gone too far on the negative side,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's gone so far negative that now it's actually probably going to exceed expectations, right? When expectations are so low and rankings and projections are based on very low expectations, then sometimes the right move is to push back. And I think in this case, we can look at this Chargers team and we can say Greg Roman did this and Jim Harbaugh did this in the past, but this is not going to be a winning team. I mean, some weeks I may not even be that competitive of a team. So Justin Herbert, now I'm not saying go and buy Justin Herbert. Wait a couple of weeks for the disappointment to really set in, but also know there are going to be games when, like in the second half, he's going to be back in the role of just, well, Justin, go out and try to keep us in this game on your own. They're going to be forced by game script out of that. So there is going to be more pass attempts. And then we're talking about McConkey. You're just picturing, well, who's Herbert going to be looking for in these 2-minute drill or these come from behind kind of situations?
Right.
Who's going to uncover? Because I like the aside about Quentin Johnston, and I think you're right to say, hey, it's only been a year, and what did we learn about Quentin Johnston? We learned he can't do things that in his draft profile said he can't do yet,
Right.
right? That's what we learned. Now it's disappointing whenever a team uses a player. I think the Chargers even said something to the effect of like, well, we know that this is what he's ready for and this is what he's not ready for. And then because of injuries, they had to put him out there to do a bunch of things that they said he wasn't ready for. And indeed, he looked not ready for it. where this can get tricky is when a player's confidence is hurt. Sometimes that can be fatal. Sometimes that can be something, no matter how talented a player is, it's hard for them to overcome that. So you hope that that doesn't really become a setback for Johnston. But the other thing about this conversation is that McConkey and Johnston both look best cast as slot receivers. So this is going to be something we need to watch, especially because it's a new coaching regime, like you said, and somebody's going to have to catch the. I mean, Justin Herbert's going to throw for 4,000 yards, even if this team is going to be low in neutral situations and low in terms of when they have a lead, as what Jim Harbaugh has done in the past. But I think that even Jim Harbaugh is going to have to rely on the pass when the team falls behind by more than a score in the second half. So, like you said, we talked before we were on the air. You're doing it at The Athletic. You've got rankings out there. I've got a cool tool where people can adjust projections and add their own touch. But what that implies, Jake, is after the draft, you went back and made some adjustments. Again, still, it's only 2 weeks so far, really. We're absorbing, I guess, what the teams are saying, a few rookie minicamp nuggets here and there, not much really out of the rookie mini camps, but we are going to get more out of OTAs. Then we're getting to training camp. We're going to continue to adjust. This is continuing to be a moving target. But for now, Jake, who did you make the biggest adjustments, up or down, on in your rankings and your projections after the draft?
So one that comes to mind immediately, and somebody that actually jumped in the comments, they're like, "Whoa, is Michael Pittman a fade?" ? And it came down to the fact that it has nothing. And he's like, "Is it because of Anthony Richardson?" I said, honestly, it's not really because of Anthony Richardson. I mean, part of it is the offense. But the passing opportunity is going to be limited compared. You could hope that, Lamar Jackson's best season is maybe something he could do as a passer. All that aside, it really came down to the surprise, in my opinion, of the draft pick of Adonai Mitchell, which, no matter how you feel about him, whether the off-field stuff is true or not, whatever, he's a talented wide receiver. And it's not that I think he's going to come in and push Michael Pittman for the lead role. It just comes down to now why, with Josh Downs, who I still like, you have a great trio of wide receivers that I think you argue on paper. Obviously, things can change. But I think on paper, we're talking about a top 10 unit for those three, with Pittman, Mitchell, and Downs, if Mitchell hits and is what people think he is. And my point was, now you don't need to force 140, 150 targets to Michael Pittman. And if you're talking about a 22% target share for Michael Pittman, which is still a very strong target share, but you're talking about now this offense not passing as much as most, you take that out, and you're talking about 110, 115 targets. Maybe you push it up to the 120s, but even then, if you give us what Michael Pittman was doing, and again, we're trying to extrapolate over a very small sample because Anthony Richardson got hurt last year.
Right.
But when you come down to it, like my projections came out, he didn't even have 1,000 yards. And I'm looking at that. And now this is where, you come into the fact that I tell people all the time, I do rankings, then my projections, and then I circle back through my projections to do new rankings and say, where do my projections make me think twice? I always use this example to say, like, I even second guess my projections to say they're not always going to be right. They're 50% right, I would love. But Lamar Jackson, the very first year, his MVP season, he checked in as my number 2 quarterback. And I went, whoa, let's chill out there. These are some aggressive numbers. And I pushed him back, and I shouldn't have. This is the opposite direction. These numbers for Pittman checked him in at 44. And I'm like, that's too low. Even if Pittman loses 20% of his target, that's still too low. But it's still much lower than I even expected. So I actually did move him down my rankings because of that. He was around top 20, 22, which I was already lower than most on. And now he's mid-20s. And I think that's a fair risk and upside place for him to be. Do you want to pause on him before I give you the biggest mover up? Or do you? Because I feel like
let's pause. Let's pause. Yeah, because, we can talk about some Colts-specific topics, but I think you bring up some great general fantasy football thinking topics there. Let's talk specifically about Pittman. And you're right, the difficulty with Pittman is that we had such a small sample size with Anthony Richardson. And if you extrapolate that sample size, it's not very promising for Pittman. And then you add A.D. Mitchell, and I guess that I guess that the actual situation here is, if we're going to zoom back, is this is great for Anthony Richardson, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the real headline here is you add this piece for Anthony Richardson, and if you want to get in on the Anthony Richardson train, we're gaining momentum now, because I mean, you have Shane Steichen, and just based on what happened with the Eagles last year, we have to say, solve for X. What happened to the Eagles offense? Why did it struggle? Well, Shane Steichen left, so we have to think that. I mean, look what he did with Gardner Minshew. To the point of Michael Pittman actually being a pretty good option last year. It was because, well, with
Mm-hmm.
Gardner Minshew, and we'll see what Minshew does with the Raiders. We'll see if he even beats out Aiden O'Connell with the Raiders. But if you have Anthony Richardson, 11 on 11 football, and I guess if another headline here is maybe Jonathan Taylor, because now you have it even less likely that Taylor's going to face any kind of heavy or even box. He's going to face light boxes, because with Mitchell and Downs out there and the run threat that Anthony Richardson is, defenses are going to be put in a bind. And then the possession receiver, and let's not forget about Jelani Woods. And I say let's not forget about Jelani Woods because he, in his rookie year before he got hurt, looked like a red zone force. He just looked like one of those guys, like Jimmy Graham style. Like, just get it in his vicinity, and you're gonna win a touchdown on that play. So you're right that what's good for Anthony Richardson, what's good for Taylor, what's good for the Colts, it might be bad for the individual pieces of the passing game. And Michael Pittman, like you said, isn't going to have to be this clear number one receiver that they have to rely on third downs. The strangest thing about this situation, Jake, this is probably the only situation in the league where, from a passing standpoint, I don't want to say that you would. Let me make sure to use my words carefully. It would be beneficial for the fantasy values of the Colts receivers if the starting quarterback got hurt. I think that's just like
Yeah.
this is the only team you would say that, and it just happens to be a player that played got hurt 3 times in 3 games, basically. So, that's what's funny about fantasy football, is you can put all this work in like the most likely scenario, which is Anthony Richardson plays 15, 16 games. And then if Anthony Richardson get hurt and Joe Flacco, look at what Joe Flacco did for the Browns pass offense last year. Look what he did for David Njoku. Look what he did for Amari Cooper until Cooper got banged up. So if Joe Flacco were to take over this offense, my oh my,
Yep.
would that change things? And it could happen. So we have to contemplate that. Now, the larger topics that I think are really interesting that you brought up is projections versus rankings, and how if you do both, I think that projections stand for, tell me what you think about this proposition. Projections, I always say, keep you honest,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to start at a believable team total, and then you have to start with, and projections, the reason projections and rankings are different and should be different is projections are just one data point, and they represent the mean outcome or the median outcome, if you want, but an average outcome. What's the average? If we simulated the season 50 times, what would the average outcome for the players be? But there's a lot of information that you're thinking about and processing that doesn't go into your one data point projection that you can put into your rankings, because rankings, you're looking at a range of outcomes, and you're really
Yep.
ordering players by what's the range outcomes. How high is the highest end of that range? What's the likelihood that they end up on different points? What events, like we're talking about Joe Flacco starting, what events could push them into that high range? How likely are those events? But then, like you said, the key is you go back and look at your projections, you look at your rankings, you compare them, you say, do I really believe it? And it can be, do I really believe the process that I use to make my projections? Because like you said, sometimes you go back and you change the projections. I do this every week, doing our weekly projections and weekly rankings. I'll do the projections on a team by team basis, based on the matchup, based on trends, and then it just gets ordered based on what I projected. Then I go back and I say, do I really believe that? And sometimes I talk by my process, I talk myself into something I didn't believe when I started the projections. But then sometimes I go back and change it. So it's an interesting tug of war, like, between those two things. But the point is, we're checking on ourselves. We're doing something, a process that doesn't start with our priors, and just doing a process and then comparing those two things. So and anything you want to say about that part of the process of doing this thing that we do?
So yeah, I could not agree more. I think that you said it perfectly, and really what it comes down to touch on the ranking side of it real quick, and I don't want to speak for you, but I'm assuming a lot of people do the same thing, is I always talk about like wide receiver 4s and 5s when we get into this range of what's the difference between projections and rankings. And a perfect example is this year, Rome Odunze, last year, Jackson Smith-Njigba. Like, of course, if everybody stays healthy, the downside is Smith-Njigba was a wide receiver 5. But if I'm going into my drafts, am I really going to sit there and say, you know what? Yeah, I really want Jacoby Myers over Smith-Njigba. I'll be like, no.
No.
Do I want Jacoby Myers over Odunze? No, because the difference is, what is Jacoby Myers' peak output and what is Odunze's peak output? Of course, there's factors, as you mentioned. In this case, I'm talking injury. But that's why rankings will be different because, yeah, you want the upside. So couldn't agree with you more. It's like that back and forth and back and forth. And sometimes I hate, like, I go down and I spend an extra day and I'm like, I wasted too much time on this one team doing this because it's the waterfall effect too. You have to, it has to add up. I can't be like, oh, this team's going to have 7,000 yards of receiving, but the quarterback's throwing for 4.
Right. And you can do that in rankings, right? Like in rankings, you can say, hey, all 3 of Allen, Moore, and Odunze can get 1,000 yards this year, and that's going to reflect my rankings. But if you do projections where all 3 get 1,000 yards, well, Caleb Williams better be in your top 6 quarterbacks. I'll say that. And then like the third layer is when you actually are managing your teams, and sometimes you'll say, well, my projection said this, my ranking said this, and they say to start this player over this player, and then you're about to click the check marks on your lineup. You're like, you know what? I don't actually believe it. Like I'm not ready to act on this. And then that's that last layer, right? I would say that's the intuition layer where you say, okay, even based on this, when it's time to put these beliefs into action on an actual fantasy football team I run, I actually don't believe it. But who is the player that moved up the most after the draft?
So this one kind of came from default. There's actually like 2. The biggest one, though, it's back to wide receiver again, was George Pickens. And a lot of it has to do with George Pickens and the talent that we see and the potential we see. I don't think he's still met his potential. I think there's still more room. You talk about the quarterback position. There's no question about it is definitively better, whether it's Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. Now, Justin Fields will add a lot of inconsistency if he is the quarterback. But Russell Wilson just helped Cortland Sutton be a top 25 wide receiver. And there's similarities into that downfield game between Pickens and Sutton that I think you can draw. And part of it was the riser was the rookie. I originally had Roman Wilson expected for me personally. I thought Roman Wilson would be like more of a 3 on most teams. Somebody might be like, hey, Jacoby Myers, like something like that, like as our production level. And then I'm sure you saw the same reports about Mike Tomlin putting him against Mitchell in practices and saying, you're going to face the top corner, loves what he sees from him. And when you hear a coach do that and then you see them drafted, what was expected, at least by me, a little bit higher than I was expecting Roman Wilson to go, you kind of say like, well, hey, this is something I need to factor into my opinion, and that he's going to step onto the field and immediately be the 2. Now, of course, this isn't the 2 as of like a Devontae Smith 2, but it's enough that Roman Wilson went from somebody that initially, and we're speculating so much with rookies, but somebody I was thinking was going to be like a wide receiver 5 or 6 that's now in a wide receiver 4 conversation. Not huge, but both of them went up. Pickens is near my top 20 in projections and my rankings just because of the volume. You're talking about the 140 targets. That's something I could see for Pickens, and I think that's a big jump for him. One other that falls into that same conversation as seeing like by default they didn't add anybody, but they actually did something at the quarterback position was Terry McLaurin and then their draft and Jahan Dotson. I think Jahan Dotson's a potential. And this is a guy that I do have a soft spot. Loved him out of college. Love what we saw in the rookie season. I think Sam Howell should have. I don't know if there's a cloak of invisibility on Jahan Dotson at times, but Sam Howell not turning to it. Like he throws to him 4 times in the first quarter and then forgets about him for the rest of the game. Like, what the hell is going on? And part of it too, I brought this up, is that Ron Rivera is part of the problem. Like, remember we sat here and were like, what? Where's Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson? And they're like looking on the field. And, oh, look, there's Dax Milne and Diami Brown. What the hell is happening right now? So I think by default, when you add in Daniels, who is a good downfield thrower that people don't realize a lot, I think because they inherently want to draw the Justin Fields comparison and then they think of all the negatives. I think Daniels is much better. Of course, there's concern with him as well. But McLaurin and Dotson, I both think, moved up quite a bit just because of the drafting of Daniels and that they didn't really do much. McCaffrey, I think, is a fine third piece, a nice safety valve. I think McCaffrey's getting overrated a little bit just because of his name. And that may just be me projecting there.
No. Well, I think that it's what makes him intriguing to the NFL and in a dynasty fantasy football perspective. But he's a project. I mean, he's a converted quarterback. He's got the athleticism. He just doesn't know the position yet. So not so much this year. But to tie things up, and we're going to do like 6 degrees of Justin Fields in this conversation, right? You've already brought him up. But I think that he impacts both of these situations you brought up, the Steelers and Washington. And McLaurin and Pickens are similar here, right? Because the idea with both of these guys is, what can they do with a quarterback, with a semi-functional, semi-competent quarterback? We're not asking for a lot here. And you could say, well, in a worst-case scenario, Jayden Daniels is going to be Justin Fields. Or you can say, from a passing standpoint for the Steelers, I would guess that most people would say you're projecting the Steelers. If I project the Steelers passing offense with Russell Wilson, I'm going to project it higher than I would with Justin Fields. I would guess. Yeah. So let's say in both scenarios, right? The worst case scenario is that Jayden Daniels is Justin Fields for 2024 and that Justin Fields is the Steelers quarterback in 2024.
Yeah.
Well, what did that do for DJ Moore last year?
Exactly.
I mean,
people forgot that.
No problem. That's fine. DJ Moore, I think because of the running threat that Justin Fields presents, because Justin Fields, he doesn't lack arm talent. He doesn't lack arm strength. He keeps the deep field in play. And DJ Moore, who until last year we said, the quarterbacks, if he just could play with a quarterback, we didn't know Baker Mayfield was going to end up being good for a little bit, kind of, again. But if he could just play with somebody, and last year we saw it. So Pickens, for sure, is a player that, Jake, I think within 2 or 3 weeks, and we're going to get the schedule next week, so we'll see about this take once we see the Steelers' first 2 or 3 matchups. But I think he's a player that, especially if you're doing week-to-week projections, immediately you put up into your top 10. Like, we watch him for a couple of weeks, because look at what Mason Rudolph did for him. Mason Rudolph. Yeah. Come on, how many players have we said, well, what a great improvement to his fantasy prospects when Mason Rudolph took over. But that actually happened. That actually happened for George Pickens last year. And we'll see. McLaurin, I think with Jayden Daniels, like you said, it was the downfield passing, and Jahan Dotson gets a fresh start. So hopefully, Cliff Kingsbury. I mean, I'll bring up the name Cliff Kingsbury too, because he's going to take over the offense. Dan Quinn's not going to lean in on the offensive side. It's going to be Cliff Kingsbury's offense.
Yeah.
And that in some ways implicates what you think about Arizona. Was he holding back Arizona? The offense, Drew Petzing's offense from the Kevin Stefanski tree actually was not, exceeded expectations last year, let's say, with the quarterbacks other than Kyler Murray. And now Kyler Murray, 2 years clear of ACL surgery, should be ready to unlock some of the things that, at times Joshua Dobbs could. And you add Marvin Harrison Jr. Arizona is a sleeper offense to take a step forward. Okay, let's play a little game. I
think there's a tie.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think there's a tie there too with Kingsbury in the fact that one of the things, whether you believe he was holding them back or not, I'm not saying you do, I'm just saying for people out there.
Yeah.
The people Kingsbury likes the running quarterback. Like, no. Kingsbury likes people who extend plays. And now the biggest thing, and I talked about this on my podcast yesterday with Harditz, and we agreed with this as well, is that the concern with Daniels is that he can extend plays, but a lot of times he'll say, I didn't see my second read, I'm going to take off running. If he needs more patience in the pocket for that, but he can extend those plays, then that's where you can see the growth. So it could be a really shaky first year. And then there was one more name. Jameson Williams. Williams, like you talk about default as in like nothing getting thrown in there, and somebody just 2 years ago, we're talking about forget how lauded he was coming into the draft, and then the injuries was the only thing that was going to hold him back. The Lions told us that they're going to this is his chance to finally show up and as the number 2. I'm in on some Jameson Williams as like a top 35-40 wide receiver this year.
Yeah, I think if you're drafting best ball right now, he's you write it down in pen at his ADP.
Yes,
because his game is designed for best ball as a deep target. The other thing you have to like about Jameson Williams is Jake, I don't even care the player at this point. If you just tell me a Detroit Lion, I'm interested because this offense is maximizing the potential of its players. It's maximizing. You can look at the distribution. How is it that we have Gibbs as a late first, early second round pick? Running back one, Sam Laporta, tight end one, Mamon St. Brown. There's a wide receiver one. He's going around the end of the first, second round, and you have even David Montgomery and his touchdown potential. And now you have Jameson Williams. He looks like the fifth mouth to feed in this offense. And yeah, this is kind of a Jared Goff take. Just only play Jared Goff when he's indoors, and you're fine. He's part of a quarterback committee for your fantasy team, but he's a great value because this offense maximizes the value of its players. It puts its players in positions to succeed. And with Jameson Williams, now Josh Reynolds is gone. So you would think Jameson Williams can. It's really a referendum on Jameson Williams because if you think he's a knucklehead or you think he's just not going to transition, and we've seen some evidence that just by the way that Lions talk about him and how his first 2 years has gone, that he's going to be a tease, then fine, be out on Jameson Williams. But if he's got something, he's going to get the opportunity to show it and turn it into production, into the stuff that matters for us for fantasy.
Yep.
So that's a great one. I mean, I want any Detroit Lions. I'm watching.
Could you imagine going back 5 years and telling yourself that?
Right. Well, Dan Campbell. It's Jake. I think the whole thing is a really great episode for us to remember to be humble. And of course, we fire off our knee-jerk takes. I mean, that's part of what creates content. I don't like that term, but it's part of what we're doing. But then you keep your mind open. Same thing with the draft and what you think about the players that were drafted and where they went and what it means for fantasy football. It's okay. You take your initial stances. You got to take a stance to start out with, especially if you do what we do. That's what we do when we do rankings and projections. But then stay agile, stay flexible, be open. Puka Nacua is going to be so wonderful as a reference that I don't care what you thought about Puka Nacua after the draft. If you were just paying any attention, Jordan Rodriguez and your colleague at The Athletic, if you're paying any attention to what she was saying, and sometimes beat writers have to tell us stuff without just coming out and telling us stuff. Coaches are anymore, they're very sensitive about it. We don't talk about plays that were run at practice, right? We don't talk in specifics. Some coaches, some organizations are a little more strict than others, but there's usually some sort of, it's verboten to talk about things in specifics whenever you cover a team. But there was so much smoke around Puka Nacua. I think that she reported something to the effect of like, well, if you were thinking that Puka Nacua was going to have a big role this year, the Rams sure look like they're preparing him for a big role, So be flexible, be ready to change. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of our initial positions on some of these rookies. And what I think is fun for clarity is you have rookies you can see in tiers. When we saw the landing spot, we saw where they went in the draft. We saw rookies in tiers, and you can look at those tiers and I just want to say, like, who's your favorite? All right. So I'm going to give you a group of players, and you just tell me who's your favorite. All right.
Okay.
We already talked about Lad McConkey. If you miss out on McConkey, you're probably going to be choosing between. And if you want to, you can do something fun and say none of the above. And actually, I'll just wait for this other player. Out of Brian Thomas, the first round Jacksonville Jaguar, Ricky Pearsall, the first round San Francisco 49er, and Keon Coleman might as well have been a first round Buffalo Bill. Who do you like the best out of those three?
It was funny. I'm like, you said Brian Thomas, and I'm like, I got to hear the rest of the list. Let me hear it. Let me make sure, because I would just fire off Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas for me is going to be tough to get me off of for a couple reasons. So you talk about tiers. What I do over at The Athletic before the draft, I do tiers. I used to do ranks years ago, and then I you know what, this makes no sense because we change our own ranks after where they land. And I was like, so let's talk about them in tiers because that gives a better idea of like what's the capability of this player in the NFL. And for Brian Thomas, I put him in a 1.5 this year, or basically like kind of like he's any other year probably in tier 1, which kind of sounds like it's almost like counterintuitive because it's like, well, then he should be
Right.
tier 1. I was like, but I'm not going to make a tier 0.5 for Marvin Harrison and the other two. But he's that good, but he's just not quite on their level. But he was so much better, in my opinion, like just clearly better than the tier 2 guys. So I gave him a 1.5. And the situation he's going into with no Calvin Ridley, I basically said, what is stopping everybody from getting excited about him putting up Calvin Ridley's numbers that we just saw last year? Like, he is arguably, in my opinion, I'm not going to say he definitively is, but arguably, I think better all around than Calvin Ridley. And I said that he could put up Calvin Ridley's numbers and be more consistent in doing so. So Brian Thomas is going to be my pick. You could have probably thrown in 3 or 4 other names, and I would have just said Brian Thomas. I was trying to, like I said, I was trying to make sure you I gave you time because you could have surprised me and thrown in like a neighbors, but I'm like, nope, Brian Thomas is the guy.
And I think what I would add to what you said is the reason Brian Thomas, you say he would be tier 1. Like last year, he would have been tier 1. Last year, he would have been in last year's class. He would have been the top ranked rookie wide receiver. So it's just the quality of, I've said it a lot over the last month or two, all 3 of the top 3 receivers in this class would be number 1 in most draft classes. It just happens. And I think there's an argument, Jake, that the best 3 football players in this draft were the 3 wide receivers. We're not talking about positional value. We're not talking about you need a quarterback or you need offensive tackle or tone-setting draft picks for the Chargers or whatever. Just who are the players that at this point represent the true blue chip prospects in this draft? And it was the 3 wide receivers. But Brian Thomas, and then you have Zay Jones getting released. Not that should matter. I mean, I always like to preach at this time of year. Look, don't worry about the first year of opportunity for these rookies, because if they're good, if they can play, the opportunity will be created by that. And even if they get immediate opportunity, if they can't play, like remember Bishop Sankey, if they're not actually good, so I don't want to pick on Bishop Sankey, but it was just the first name that popped in my head of like, really, opportunity, immediate opportunity. Well, that just means immediate opportunity to find out that they're not good players or not. I mean, they're all good players. If you're drafted, if you're on an NFL roster, you're a good football player, but not compared to the other players in the NFL. Brian Thomas has that ability. I think there was a consensus in his rookie scouting report that, we know he's big and he's fast and he's going to be a vertical threat if he can develop something. I mean, so now you're looking at like a DK Metcalf kind of presence, but if he can
actually
develop,
compared him to Nico Collins.
Or Nico's good to go down a downfield receiver. If he can develop some of the other parts of the route tree, that now we're cooking with gas. And it's exciting for Jacksonville in so much as, like you said, I almost felt like they were chasing Calvin Ridley. They didn't keep Ridley, so they were going to have to do something to address that. And they were able to trade down, got a 3rd and 4th next year from Minnesota, and still got Thomas. Okay, let's talk about some running back tiers. Okay. As an aside, I love this tier on its own, and I find it vexing to try to pick one, but I like all 3. I like all 3 to an extent this year, but 2-3 years down the line, I really like this tier. Blake Corum, MarShawn, Lloyd, and Jaylen Wright.
I'm laughing because those are my 3, 4, and 5 or when it comes to rookie running backs. So, like, I'm with you. If we were only talking 2024, and I'm going to kind of go right to what you were talking about, the opportunity, the biggest opportunity, I think, in our face, and we're talking depth-wise, is Corum because there's 1 in front of him. Lloyd, I do think, steps in as the number 2. Like, we're projecting our opinions, the talent, and everything like that. I think he immediately steps past A.J. Dillon. Jaylen Wright, I think is just stuck. You got 2 guys in front of you, but hey, you know what? You said it. If you're going to show off, your talent's going to show out. I mean, you could push for the 1 or 2 on that team, but there's 2 guys involved. I think a lot of people are similarly thinking he's going to replace. He's going to be the new Raheem Mostert, and I'm okay with that. But it comes down with Corum. This is coming from somebody who likes Kyren Williams. Now, mind you, like, it has nothing to do with what we talked about before before the show about being a Notre Dame fan. I just liked Kyren Williams. I agree that the size is concerning. If you told me right now Sean McVay is going to lock into the workload he was giving Kyren Williams last year, I'd be like, no, he is not lasting the entire season. There's no way. Most running backs are not lasting the entire season with that kind of workload. To go back I bring this up all the time. You'll remember this. The Vegas props were 19.5 rushing attempts for Kyren Williams, and he was going over by 3 or 4 attempts. Like, that's an insane thing to think about in today's NFL. And if you said that, the one is I never predict injuries. I always predict everybody to play 17 games for projections just because I feel like that's a trap. But that aside, when now we're talking about our rankings and thinking and there's other factors involved, there's a high risk that if that kind of workload is involved, that he's going to get hurt and Corum can step in, who I wasn't even the biggest fan of. I was apparently a little bit lower than most. I still had him as a top 10 running back easily. But I think he's just great between the tackles, very solid all-around runner. I'm concerned about his passing game. But when you talk about the opportunity with the McVay, I'm not going to get too bogged down in that. I don't even care if he only gets 15 receptions and he's just Derrick Henry in that fashion. The opportunity is one that he's going to share a little bit to keep Kyren healthy. And then the complete upside is that McVay has shown us he could go from 1 week for me, like, I love you, you're the starter, you're getting 90% of the workload, to 2 weeks later, like, you did something. If it's in the locker room, in practice, we don't even know sometimes. You just ticked them off, and he's turned into the next guy. That's why I love Corum for this year. Long term, I'd probably slightly lean right, but you're with me. This group is so tight.
Yeah, well, and all got big boosts in value by where they landed. Yeah. And I don't care that they were third-round picks. I think Wright was a fourth-round pick, but the Dolphins gave up next year's third to get him. I think the real headline here is all three of these guys experienced big boosts in value by where they landed. And I don't get too hung up on draft capital for running backs because look at Isaiah Pacheco. I mean, it's like, look, the best guy is going to play. Good organizations, and these are all pretty good organizations at this point. I agree with you. And I think that I agree with you the way that you broke down the Corum thing of talking about range of outcomes. There's a range of outcomes where Blake Corum's the starting running back for the Rams before the end of the season. And there's a non-zero chance that happens. And from a fantasy standpoint, and this is where the flip side of the question is, how far do you move down Kyren Williams? Because if you were looking at Blake Corum's profile before the draft, one of the big glowing strengths was goal line, short yardage running. I mean, he's really good at that. We're going to assume rational coaching. You're going to deploy your player that is best at something in that situation. And the other reason I became much more interested, and I agree with you, I had Corum further. He's the one I would take out of this tier, but they're so closely packed that if Wright is going 3, 4, 5 picks after Corum, then give me Wright at that price. If I have to, pay, the Wright might be the most valuable because he's often going third, or at least the best value in terms of picks. But with Corum, the other thing, I'm going to probably say this so many times, people are going to get sick of hearing me say it, but it's one of the few backfields, Jake, where he goes and might be the most athletic running back in that backfield. Kyren Williams why did he fall in the draft? It was his athletic testing numbers. It's like if you like Kyren Williams, you might like Bucky Irving in this draft because you're saying he's productive. I like what I see, but the measurables look like a death knell in terms of knockout factors, different models that people use. Kyren Williams overcame that, but it also makes him a little more precarious, where Blake Corum, I thought, was probably wherever he landed was going to be outshined athletically by at least one running back, maybe two. And the Rams happen to be one of those teams. And he's just so assignment sound. He's just a coach's catnip for coaches are assignment sound running backs. They like that more than long speed. They like that more than the ability to break tackles. But speaking of long speed, the thing about Jaylen Wright, and this, I'm just pulling together themes we've been talking about, Jake, during the show, is you have to think about likelihoods. And I agree with you. You don't project injuries when it comes to projections, but you do include the path to value in the case of an injury when it comes to especially running backs. And we already see that Devin Achane, Jake, if Devin Achane has a similar season to last year, we're going to say, well, he can't stay healthy. I mean, he's a great player, but he can't stay healthy. And that's going to really discourage Mike McDaniel from ever giving him more than 12 or 15 touches in a game, right? If he has like multiple injuries that cause him to miss games this year, like he did last year. Raheem Mostert's 31, 32. Jaylen Wright very easily could become the most valuable running back on this roster within the next 2 to 3 years. And it's an incredible running game. It's a running game that puts rockets on the back of its players in terms of fantasy value. You remember, wasn't there a game last year when both the running backs scored 4 touchdowns in one game? So, and Jaylen Wright
And that's
also.
why
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, and that goes back to our earlier conversation of like, yeah, Jaylen Wright might be in my 40, 50, like 50-ish range as running back, but he's also in front of like, what's the upside of drafting Alexander Madison at that point? No,
Sure.
I'm taking Jaylen Wright because, again, to go back to this whole kind of conversation we're having today is, I'm looking for Blake Corum's in front of Alexander. There's a lot of people in front of Alexander Madison because
Poor
what's the
Bishop
upside?
Sankey and Alexander Madison.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. And that's why, like, if Zamir White gets hurt and Madison is the lead, so what? We've seen it.
I don't
we know
even
what
care.
that
Yeah,
means.
Exactly. The lure of the unknown is an important thing in fantasy football. And if you find yourself like distracted by shiny objects and the lure of the unknown, I think you're playing fantasy football the right way. Because if we already know, then we already know it's in that box. We already know what we're going to see. Before we go off the rails and talk about whatever, real quick, just touching on real quick developments around the league over the last week or so. The biggest one, of course, Rashee Rice getting in trouble again. You can feel a ripple with her. Like, oh. What's the move? What's the fantasy football move here? Who are you pivoting to, or are you really, or is maybe there is no move on this news?
So I feel like the move is actually going to be more reactional in a few weeks as drafts continue to happen, and that's going to start being fading Xavier Worthy. Like, I think that the excitement of every single, we've done this for 4 straight years now. We go back to Mecole Hardman and go back to that draft, and we were like, oh my gosh, the Chiefs drafted Mecole Hardman, go get him. And then, they drafted Sky Moore, go get him. They traded for Kadarius Toney, go get him. Like, it's just like everybody just wants to say it's going to be great. And for all intents and purposes, Rashee Rice last year was great for fantasy on volume. That's what got him there. But as a production on an efficiency basis is actually pretty miserable. So I was actually a little bit off of Rashee Rice for where people had him this year before this even started. And then they signed Hollywood Brown. And I'm not saying go get Hollywood Brown, but if you're going to give me Xavier Worthy, who has a lot of similarities to Marquise Brown, and you're going to say Xavier Worthy is going to cost me a 5th rounder and Marquise Brown is going to cost me a 9th because nobody wants him anymore, I'm drafting Marquise Brown. As crazy as that. Like, I never really wanted him before, but that's my move on that one, is to fade Xavier Worthy and move to Hollywood Brown.
Yes, absolutely. I think Marquise Brown is a player that is going to probably end up being on very prominent on my target lists, just because, like you said, okay, Xavier Worthy, draft pick. We're saying, hey, if things go well, he could end up being a player like Marquise Brown, maybe Marquise Brown plus. But he's not there yet. I mean, it's possible he could come out of the gate hot, but we already know what Marquise Brown is, and it's easy to forget that before Kyler Murray got hurt, and before DeAndre Hopkins' suspension was over 2 years ago, Marquise Brown was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver, and he had a few prominent drops, or he would have been like a top 3 fantasy wide receiver in the first 6 weeks of that year. He had opportunity to do even more, and do we really know what he can do in a higher volume, higher efficiency pass offense, catching passes from Patrick Mahomes in an offense that was woeful in downfield passing, but obviously is looking with this draft pick, with this signing, to revive that part of the passing game. Again, chances are the answer here is next, but it's the third wave of free agency. We saw some veterans sign: Tyler Boyd to Tennessee, Odell Beckham to Miami, DJ Chark to the Chargers. Anything move the needle here?
Nah, not really for me. I think we know what happens with the third option with the Dolphins and at Odell Beckham at this point in his career. Chark, depth piece. I think, they're trying to round out their wide receiver room. And then Tyler Boyd, again, just another depth piece. I think maybe this gives a glimmer of hope. Like, I was not, and I'm not a Will Levis guy. Like, I'm not a Will Levis fan. But if you were ever going to set him up to succeed,
right,
this is what you do. And you're talking about Callahan, who we know the ties to Tyler Boyd. And I will make this one comparison. I'm not saying for everybody, chill out before I finish the sentence. But, like, what we saw is, like, what you do with Josh Allen, what his concerns were coming out of college, is the same thing that the Panthers did at the end of Cam Newton's career. Okay, if you want success, let's not give you 2 6'5" dudes who don't know how to separate. Oh, wow, what a shock. That's not going to work out. And you start getting some separators. Well, like, you look at Will Levis, and he's like, okay, Treylon Burks hasn't worked out. Whatever happens with him. DeAndre Hopkins is slower. He's still one of the best at catching contested balls, but he's slower at this point. And then you bring in Ridley, which there was some concerns last year. Like, you saw the inconsistencies, and part of it was Ridley. Part of it was Ridley had coverage draped on him. And then you say, you know what? What is Will Levis? We don't really have this one piece. Who is it? It's Tyler Boyd. It is that, you know what? It's that safety valve underneath, over the middle of the field, who can get some separation. So if Will Levis is going to succeed, you're playing super flex, and I know this is a very smaller group of the people we're talking to here. Actually, you
Sure.
know what? I didn't even say deeper leagues that play like 18 rounds or something. Like,
Yeah.
throw a flyer on Will Levis. Like, it wouldn't be the biggest shock in the world if Will Levis finished as a top 15 quarterback from somebody who doesn't even like him that much.
Yeah. Well, and especially, you start to project week to week, like a Tennessee Indianapolis game or a Tennessee Houston game. Those games have shootout potential now. They just need to protect him. They did take an offensive lineman in the first round. Last one, real quick, and I'll actually pose this one as just a question. Did it surprise you when the Steelers did not pick up Najee Harris's fifth-year option?
No, not in this, not in today's NFL at all.
Yeah, I think that I have a feeling that if you did one of those articles like players whose ADP is sure to rise by the time we get to August, I think Jaylen Warren has to be one of those guys. Jaylen Warren is probably like a third, fourth, fifth round value in drafts right now, I think. Unless you think if you think the Steelers offense is going to at least just be the Mason Rudolph version of the offense. We're not even asking for more than that. Again, look at what that did to Warren and Harris's value at the end of the year. I think both Steelers running backs could be fantasy relevant, but Warren has the momentum here for sure. And if you look at it like a Arthur Smith 2023 backfield, well, Harris is Tyler Algier and Warren is Bijan Robinson. So, to take that under advisement. Okay, off the rails. I guess what I want to start with is your background. Every time I'm talking to you, I'm noticing something else. What in the background, and what I take out of it, just letting it wash over me, is you have a full life, which is a wonderful thing. And you're not, you have layers and a lot of things that mean something to you. Well, all of that stuff behind you, give me like one thing that maybe has a special meaning or means the most to you, or something that, it's back there for a reason that has some like emotional resonance for you.
I'll grab it. It's in distance here.
Mm-hmm.
It's slightly off camera depending on when we do it, but it's
Right.
It's in front of a pictured frame, and this is going to get all emotionally sappy for everybody out there. But the picture frame is me and Nicole, my wife, now when we got engaged. But also, so we did rock pouring of glass rock pouring when we got married instead of like the sand and stuff like that. And then for our 1 year anniversary, we went back and got it made into something. And we always used to send each other the infinity symbol, so we got it turned into an infinity, and the two colors that we got are mixed together, and it's kind of like imperfect. And she said it best. She was like, it's imperfectly perfect. So that's actually, and that's the infinity symbol is also around my tattoo that I got because I hate rings. So that's what that is. And if you're talking non-sappy wise, the other one would be Mooncake is from Final Space. So Olin Rogers is the creator of Final Space and a bunch of older stuff. And I've had him on my podcast a couple times, actually been to a comedy show. He actually did the video that I showed Nicole. So when I proposed to Nicole, he put a video together, and he tells stories on YouTube, if you ever saw him on YouTube. And I had him do a story, and I for my proposal, I was like, oh, honey, you got to watch this. While we were up in New York, we were on the Jersey side across looking at the city. I was like, you got to watch this new video. It's about dating. It's really funny. And it's basically like my story and how we met and stuff like that. And at the end of it, he says, turn around. Nicole, turn around, and that's where it was. So like,
oh wow,
Final Space, Olin Rogers. So yeah, a little sappy for your answer there.
No, but sappy's. That's emotional resonance, and certainly marriage or partnership, or even if you are a single person, like or other kinds of relationships, platonic relationships in your life, love. Really, what we're talking about is love. Hopefully, all of us get the opportunity to love other human beings and feel their love on this plane. I'll get sappy. I'll try to get first prize, the blue ribbon in the sappy competition, because I do think that thing. Jake, I think even what attracted us all to football or sports on some level, love is somewhere in there, or at the very least, a general sense of something that makes you light up, something that makes your soul come alive, something that pulls you out of yourself, pulls you out of your ego into the world. Like, for this person, I want to be out in the world so I can be with you, or just to experience the wave of emotion and intensity that comes from allowing yourself, like if you're a fan of a team, to be emotionally vulnerable to whatever happens with that team that day. You're outside of yourself. I really do think that we, our souls are always striving to get out of the prison of our ego, and
Yeah.
marriage or any kind of give and take relationship does that, and see, really, we could do a podcast on marriage, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, and it's great that that's the first place that your mind went when you think about everything that's represented about you in what's behind you, because that thing, you know, it's a beautiful thing to find somebody and feel like whatever my life will be with you is better than anything I could imagine without you. So let's do this. And it's
Yep.
hard out there. Life is, I mean, 2024 America, especially, life's hard, So
It's
having a
not
true
fun.
partner where you're like, I can trust you and you can trust me and we're going to take this on together. I mean, I feel for the people that are having to take it on by themselves. I feel for them, and I'll send them power and strength if you're out there listening. Okay. If you weren't doing fantasy football, what's not like something else you're passionate about, something else that you could imagine getting lost in instead of this?
Well, I would have to originally a couple years ago. Well, actually, now it's almost been 10 years since it closed. It would have been the deli, which I tried,
Oh,
and that
wow.
yeah. I think the last time we talked, that had already gone under, and I had already talked to a lot of people about it. But yeah, I tried a deli because coming from New York, New Jersey area, and our family, and didn't have that down here, and it didn't work. That could be a
Oh,
podcast of why
it's
it
a
didn't work.
the vagaries and arbitrary things you're subjected to if you're trying to make a restaurant or a place to eat like succeed as a business. It's all
But
kinds of things. Go ahead.
yeah, well, and the big thing is that like everybody's like I forget who it was, but he had to lose 1 million before he made his first million, and the big like I will say like this is a perfect example. The thing went bankrupt, but without that going bankrupt, I don't actually become full time into fantasy, and without becoming full time into fantasy, I don't have the opportunities that I have today, and I probably at that time wasn't ready to meet Nicole. Like there's a lot of things like
Sure.
as crazy as to say like that was actually a good turning point in my life. As much as it sucked to lose that money, I would not go back into that 100%. I would not go
Right.
back into the restaurants. I would go to like what Nicole is actually doing. She's coaching soccer. I would go to coaching. I always wanted to.
Oh, yeah.
I always wanted to be in sports. I think actually my real dream, and this is why I got into fantasy. So when everybody's in high school, they're like, oh, I want to be a fireman. I want to be a professional football player. I want to be like, I was the dude that was sitting there in 8th grade with my little spreadsheet writing
Yeah.
out lineups of what I
Yeah,
would do,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
trades I would
Yeah,
make.
yeah,
If I could
yeah.
be a GM, I would be a GM in a heartbeat. If the Giants called tomorrow and like, hey, fix this team, I'd be like, I will take the job immediately and I will do my best to fix the team. I'm the guy who simulates the entire Madden season to get to the off
Sure.
season and do the draft picks and trading and contracts and
Sure.
stuff like that. So there you go. It'd be either coaching or because the GM thing is like that's never gonna happen.
Right. Well, we can offer to do it for free. But
There you go.
I think that there's so much in what you said there. Well, I mean, one is you know, put yourself out there, do something, try something, just try something. My late father, Sigmund Bloom, uh, uh, I remember it back in the '80s when Nike ads started taking over the airwaves. He said, "Well, I don't know about all this stuff, but this ad that says just do it. I like that. Just do it. Just do
Yeah.
something. If you put yourself out there, something will come back to you. It might not be what you specifically asked for, and then, of course, there's always the old um, parable about, like, oh, my son broke his leg. Oh, that's bad. But then the military draft was coming through the town and he didn't have to go to the war. Oh, that's good. Oh, but then it got infected. Oh, that's bad. Like, you never know in your life the significance of events until much later on. Kierkegaard, I think I say
Mhm.
this like once a year. Life has to be lived forward, but it's only understood in reverse. And I like how you mentioned coaching, and I just want to touch on again down here in New Orleans. So many people I meet, the most important thing to them is passing on what they know to kids, passing on what they know
Yeah.
to kids. I met someone here who said that's when you are actually an adult, when that becomes the most important thing in your life is teaching kids what you know. And coaching is about coaching the sport, but it's really about making kids feel like teaching, just make you feel seen and heard, and someone cares about them and someone's on their side and try to help them, not just become the best player they're going to be. And just to really do the like, did we just become best friends or whatever? But all of us fantasy dudes are like this. So for me, it was absolutely Um, I used to keep score. I used to listen to the Pirates on the radio. It was going to be the play-by-play announcer for the Pirates. That was like, what do you want to do? That and start the revolution.
Nice.
And I would actually keep score on the Pirates games on over the radio at home, like as a kid, like 8, 9, 10-year-old kid. And my stepfather was a former professional boxer, and he would go out to this boxing gym out in the woods in Western Pennsylvania. A lot of different champions came through. Roberto Duran came through there. Burt Cooper came through there. A lot of different. I would go out there. My stepdad would be helping out. I'd be out there, like, just hanging out, picking blackberries, hanging out with the stray cats, whatever. It was out in the woods. And I had my little books of statistics. And one time I left one of them there. And Buzz Garnick, who you might have seen on Friday Night Fights, if you watch, he's been on Friday Night Fights, I don't even know, hundreds of times in the corner of different fighters. He found my little book and he called my stepdad and he said, well, this must belong to Ziggy because it definitely doesn't belong to any of the boxers. I was probably like 10 years old. I got to ask you this real quick parting shot. Okay. What makes a great deli?
Oh, it's the quality of the meat and it's the sandwiches, but it's the quality of the meat and how much is on it. Like you can have really good, like we use Thumann's, which is basically for everybody that knows boar's head. It's the Jersey. Really, really super quick for people that don't know. It's almost the exact same thing. The Thumann's and the boar's head was you weren't allowed to cross state lines way back in the day, New Jersey to New York, and that's how Thumann's came about. And boar's head. Anyway, that's the quick version. So it's basically the same thing, but that and putting like 4 or 5 ounces of meat on the sandwich, not these little wrinkly, crappy like little oh, here's your 3 slivers of meat. I hope you enjoyed all that bread and lettuce. That really makes it. And then something special. Like we had our biggest seller was the pub sandwich that I came up with. It was buffalo chicken Havarti, a creamy horseradish, red onion, lettuce, tomato, and it was a jalapeno cornbread sandwich. Like I mean, it was just out of this world. But like, yeah, something original too.
Yeah, that's wow. I'm glad we're almost done because I can go get lunch now. If you
I'm
come down to New
starving.
Orleans, yeah, and if you come down to New Orleans, there's a Philly deli, East Coast deli down on Magazine Street called Stein's. Dan Stein, who runs it, is one of the characters of New Orleans, and yeah, you'll find that he even has his little all the different imported goods that he has curated, pasta or the little canned like just clams, and we get like olive oil from him. He gets the best olive oil. So yeah, it is about quality of ingredients, and that's how somebody actually cares. We care. Jake cares at the Athletic. I care at Football Guys. Fantasy football, all of your people out there, we care because you care, because there'd be no us without you. I hope that everyone's had a chance to absorb the draft, get ready for the summer, and then the season. We'll be here for you the whole way because you're so classy.